The morning sun cast golden shadows across the Royal Hospital Chelsea as thousands of visitors queued outside the gates, clutching their tickets to Britain's most prestigious horticultural event. But today was different. Today, amidst the sea of prize-winning roses and perfectly manicured lawns, a grandson would speak to his grandmother not through words of duty or protocol, but through the ancient language of flowers and earth. What began as a simple invitation would become a profound moment of connection between two generations of royalty, revealing truths about family, legacy, and the healing power of nature that would resonate far beyond the garden walls. In a world where royal relationships are often scrutinized through the harsh lens of public opinion, this story unveils an intimate portrait of Prince Harry and Queen Elizabeth II, sharing something far more precious than crowns or titles. A genuine moment of understanding between a young man finding his way and a monarch who had spent decades tending not just to a kingdom, but to the delicate garden of family relationships. The idea came to Prince Harry during one of those restless nights that had become all too familiar since returning from his second tour of Afghanistan. He stood by the window of his apartment at Kensington Palace, watching the first light of dawn creep across the London skyline, when his eyes fell upon the carefully tended garden below. The sight of the gardeners already at work, their movements deliberate and peaceful, stirred something within him that he couldn't quite name. It was May 2013, and the Chelsea Flower Show was just weeks away. Harry had attended the prestigious event numerous times before, usually as part of his royal duties, making polite conversation with exhibitors and posing for photographs. But this year felt different. This year, he wanted to do something meaningful, something that might bridge the growing distance he felt between himself and his family, particularly his grandmother. Queen Elizabeth II had always been a constant in Harry's tumultuous life. Through his parents' bitter divorce, his mother's tragic death, and his own struggles with finding his place in the royal hierarchy, the Queen had remained steadfast, offering quiet support without judgment. Yet lately, Harry felt as though he was drifting, caught between his military service and his royal obligations, uncertain about his future path. The idea crystallized during breakfast with his private secretary. "What if I took Granny to see the gardens?" Harry asked suddenly, interrupting a discussion about his upcoming engagements. Not for a formal visit, but really see them. Show her things she might miss in all the protocol and ceremony. His secretary looked puzzled. The Queen had been patron of the Royal Horticultural Society for decades and had attended Chelsea countless times. What could Harry possibly show her that she hadn't already seen? But Harry was thinking beyond the obvious displays and medal-winning exhibits. He remembered stories his grandmother had shared about her love for the gardens at Balmoral and Windsor, how she would escape there during difficult times. He remembered watching her genuine joy when she discovered a new species of flower or observed wildlife in their natural habitat. This wasn't about horticulture. This was about connection. The formal request went through the proper channels, but Harry supplemented it with a handwritten note to his grandmother. In his characteristic and formal style, he wrote about wanting to share something special with her, away from the crowds and cameras that usually surrounded royal visits. He mentioned his recent interest in conservation work and how he'd been learning about the therapeutic benefits of gardening for veterans dealing with trauma. The Queen's response came back within days. Written in her precise handwriting on Buckingham Palace letterhead, "I would be delighted to see the gardens through your eyes, Harry. Perhaps you might teach an old gardener something new." Planning the visit required delicate coordination. The Chelsea Flower Show typically closed to the public on Friday evening, with the Royal Horticultural Society hosting exclusive preview for members on the weekend before reopening. Harry arranged for their visit to take place during this quieter period, when they could move freely without the usual crowds of admirers and photographers. In the weeks leading up to the show, Harry threw himself into research with an enthusiasm that surprised even him. He contacted garden designers, read about innovative horticultural techniques, and spoke with veterans who had found solace in gardening programs. He visited community gardens in London, spending time with elderly gardeners who shared their wisdom about plants that had sustained them through decades of change. One conversation particularly struck him. An elderly veteran named George, who tended a small plot in a South London community garden, spoke about how working with soil had helped him process memories from World War II. "Plants don't judge," George had said, his weathered hands gentle with a young tomato seedling. "They just respond to care. Sometimes that's all any of us need." Harry began to understand that gardens weren't just about beauty or botanical achievement. They were spaces of healing, growth, and quiet transformation. This realization shaped his vision for the tour he wanted to give his grandmother. As the day approached, Harry felt nervous in a way he rarely experienced before public engagements. This wasn't about performing royal duties. This was about sharing something personal, something that mattered to him. He worried that his grandmother might find his approach too sentimental, or that his newfound passion might seem trivial compared to her decades of experience. The night before their visit, Harry walked through his own small garden at Nottingham Cottage, the modest two-bedroom house on the Kensington Palace grounds that had become his sanctuary. He had recently begun cultivating it himself, learning through trial and error how to nurture plants from seed to bloom. The garden was far from perfect. Some plants thrived while others struggled, and weeds persistently appeared despite his efforts. But it was his. Standing among the lavender and rosemary he had planted, Harry thought about his grandmother's own relationship with gardens. She had overseen the grounds at multiple royal residences, had commissioned new plantings, and had found peace in those green spaces during some of the monarchy's most challenging periods. Perhaps, he thought, she would understand what he was trying to share. The morning of their visit dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect English weather that made gardens seem almost magical. Harry dressed carefully, choosing casual clothes that would allow him to move easily through the exhibition grounds. He had asked for minimal security presence, wanting the visit to feel as natural and unguarded as possible. When he arrived at the Royal Hospital Chelsea, the grounds were already bustling with activity. Garden designers were making final adjustments to their displays, watering plants, and arranging elements with the focused intensity of artists preparing for a gallery opening. The air was fragrant with the scent of roses, herbs, and fresh earth. Harry walked through the main avenue, first getting a sense of the layout and identifying the specific gardens and exhibits he wanted to share with the Queen. He wasn't interested in the most obviously impressive displays, the grand formal gardens that would undoubtedly win medals. Instead, he was drawn to quieter corners, innovative approaches to sustainability, and gardens that told stories about healing and transformation. At one exhibit, he stopped to speak with a designer who had created a garden specifically for people living with dementia, using plants chosen for their sensory qualities and memory-triggering properties. The designer explained how certain scents could help patients recall positive memories and how the act of touching different textures could provide comfort during moments of confusion. Another garden caught his attention for its focus on food production in small spaces, demonstrating how urban dwellers could grow their own vegetables and herbs. The exhibit included raised beds designed for people with mobility challenges and companion plantings that supported both human nutrition and pollinator habitats. These were the stories Harry wanted to share with his grandmother. Not just the technical achievement of prize-winning horticulture, but the human stories of how gardens could serve communities, heal wounds, and create connections across generations and circumstances. As the appointed time for the Queen's arrival approached, Harry positioned himself near the main entrance, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was his grandmother, but it was also the Queen, and he wanted to strike the right balance between familial affection and appropriate respect. When her car pulled up, Harry felt his nervousness fade, replaced by genuine warmth. The Queen stepped out wearing a practical outfit suitable for walking through gardens, sensible shoes, a light cardigan, and her ever-present handbag. But it was her expression that reassured him. She looked genuinely curious and pleased, the formal mask of official engagements temporarily set aside. "Well then, Harry," she said with a slight smile, "I'm ready to see these gardens of yours. Lead the way." As they began walking together into the exhibition grounds, Harry felt a sense of possibility opening up before them. This wasn't just a garden tour. It was an opportunity to share something meaningful with someone who mattered deeply to him. The afternoon stretched ahead, full of potential for discovery, connection, and perhaps understanding. The sun climbed higher in the clear sky as they made their way deeper into the heart of the Chelsea Flower Show, grandmother and grandson walking side by side, ready to explore not just the beauty of the gardens, but the possibilities that lay hidden in quiet moments of shared attention and genuine curiosity about the world around them. Harry guided the Queen away from the main thoroughfare, where most visitors would naturally gravitate toward the largest and most spectacular displays. Instead, he led her down a quieter path lined with smaller, more intimate garden spaces. His choice was deliberate. He wanted their first stop to be somewhere that would invite contemplation rather than impose grandeur. The garden he had selected was titled Memories in Bloom, designed by Sarah Chun, a landscape architect who specialized in therapeutic gardens. The space was modest in size, but rich in thoughtful details. Winding paths created areas of discovery, while carefully chosen plants engaged multiple senses. The design incorporated raised beds at various heights, making the garden accessible to people with different physical capabilities. "I thought you might find this interesting, Granny," Harry said, using the informal address that had been natural between them since childhood. "It's not the biggest or flashiest garden here, but it has something special." The Queen paused at the entrance, her experienced eye taking in the overall composition before focusing on individual elements. She had judged gardens before and knew how to read the designer's intentions. But something about Harry's enthusiasm made her approach this space differently. Sarah Chun appeared from behind a cluster of aromatic herbs, soil under her fingernails, and genuine excitement in her eyes. She had been told that Prince Harry might bring a special visitor, but seeing the Queen in person in her garden created a moment of awe that she struggled to contain professionally. "Your Majesty," Sarah began, but Harry quickly intervened. "Sarah, could you share with my grandmother what inspired this garden? The real story behind it." Sarah's nervousness transformed into passion as she began explaining her work. "I designed this space after working with my own grandfather during his battle with Alzheimer's disease. I noticed how certain plants could trigger memories and emotions that seemed lost. The lavender reminded him of my grandmother's soap. The mint brought back stories of summer drinks in his childhood garden." The Queen's attention sharpened. She had lived through decades where mental health was rarely discussed openly, and the idea of using gardens therapeutically was both familiar and revolutionary to her. At Sandringham and Balmoral, she had always found peace in her gardens, but she had never articulated this as therapy. Harry watched his grandmother's face as Sarah continued her explanation. He could see genuine interest replacing polite attention. "Each plant here was chosen not just for beauty," Sarah explained, "but for its ability to engage memory and emotion. The rosemary is for remembrance, of course, but also because its scent is so distinctive that it can anchor people who feel lost in confusion." The Queen moved slowly through the garden, occasionally reaching out to touch a leaf or lean closer to catch a particular fragrance. At one point, she stopped beside a patch of sweet peas climbing a trellis. "My mother grew these," she said quietly. "The scent always takes me back to summer afternoons at Royal Lodge when I was a child." Harry felt a moment of triumph. This was exactly what he had hoped for, not just appreciation for horticultural achievement, but personal connection and memory. He had intuited that his grandmother, despite her public reserve, had deep emotional connections to gardens that went far beyond their formal beauty. Sarah showed them a section where different herbs were planted in containers that could be easily moved and rearranged. For people dealing with dementia or depression, the act of caring for plants provides purpose and routine, she explained. But more than that, it connects them to the cycle of growth and renewal that reminds us life continues even through difficult seasons. The Queen asked practical questions that revealed her own extensive gardening knowledge. She inquired about soil composition, drainage, and which varieties performed best in different weather conditions. But Harry noticed she also asked about the people who use such gardens, how they responded to different plants, whether families found comfort in gardening together during difficult times. As they prepared to leave the first garden, the Queen turned to Harry with an expression he hadn't seen before, curiosity mixed with appreciation for his insight. "How did you know to bring me here?" she asked. Harry hesitated, unsure how much to share about his own struggles with finding meaning and purpose after his military service. "I've been thinking a lot about healing," he said finally, "about how we help people, including ourselves, deal with difficult experiences. Gardens keep coming up in conversations with veterans I've met. They talk about finding peace in growing things." The Queen nodded slowly. She had lived through World War II, had seen the country rebuild itself, had watched generations deal with trauma and loss. The idea that gardens could be part of that healing process resonated with her own experience, even if she had never framed it in such terms. As they walked toward their next destination, Harry felt emboldened by his grandmother's response. He had worried that his approach might seem too emotional or unconventional, but the Queen's genuine engagement encouraged him to continue sharing his discoveries. Their next stop was a striking contrast to the therapeutic garden. Growing Future was an innovative urban farming display that demonstrated how small spaces could produce significant amounts of food. Vertical growing systems maximized yield while minimizing water usage, and integrated pest management reduced the need for chemical interventions. The designer, Marcus Thompson, was a former chef who had transitioned to urban agriculture after becoming concerned about food security in London's low-income neighborhoods. His garden showcased practical solutions that could be implemented on balconies, rooftops, or small community plots. The average family can grow 30% of their fresh vegetables in a space smaller than a parking spot, Marcus explained, showing them towers of leafy greens and compact fruiting plants. But this isn't just about food production. It's about community, education, and giving people agency over their own nutrition. Harry had discovered Marcus's work through a veteran who had started growing food as therapy and ended up creating a small business selling microgreens to local restaurants. The story embodied themes that had become important to Harry: service, purpose, and the way individual healing could expand into community benefit. The Queen examined the growing systems with a practical eye of someone who had managed large agricultural estates. She asked about yield per square foot, water efficiency, and the economics of small-scale food production. But she also listened carefully as Marcus described teaching children to grow their own food and how the knowledge was being shared across generations in immigrant communities. "My grandmother grew vegetables during the war," Marcus mentioned. "She saved seeds and shared them with neighbors. This isn't really new technology. It's old wisdom applied with new tools." Harry saw his grandmother's slight smile at this reference. The Queen had lived through the Victory Garden campaigns of World War II, when citizens were encouraged to grow their own food to support the war effort. The connection between past and present, between national resilience and individual action, was exactly the kind of bridge Harry had hoped to illuminate. As they moved through the display, Harry pointed out details that connected to broader themes he had been exploring. A section demonstrating companion planting showed how different crops could support each other's growth, reducing pests naturally and improving soil health. "It's like the way military units work together," Harry observed. "Each element serves its own purpose, but also supports the whole." The Queen paused at a display showing heritage seeds, varieties that had been preserved by gardeners across generations. Some were vegetables that had sustained communities during difficult times. Others were flowers that carried cultural significance for different immigrant groups, now growing them in London gardens. "Continuity," the Queen said, almost to herself. Harry understood that she was thinking about more than seeds, about the way traditions and knowledge passed from one generation to the next, about the responsibility of preservation that had shaped her entire life. Marcus showed them a section where children had painted stones to mark their planted rows, and small signs identified which community groups had contributed to different parts of the garden. The space buzzed with the energy of collaboration and shared purpose. "Food security is national security," Marcus said, echoing themes that had resonance for both his visitors. "But it's also about dignity and community resilience. When people can grow their own food, they're less dependent on systems that might fail them." As they concluded their visit to the urban farming display, Harry felt increasingly confident in his choice to focus on gardens that told stories about human connection and practical solutions to real problems. His grandmother's engagement had been genuine and sustained, her questions revealing both her extensive knowledge and her willingness to learn new approaches. The afternoon sun was warming the air, and the gardens around them were alive with the sound of bees, the rustle of leaves, and the distant murmur of other visitors. Harry and the Queen walked companionably between exhibits, the formal distance that usually characterized royal interactions gradually giving way to something more natural and collaborative. "Where to next?" the Queen asked, and Harry heard in her voice the same curiosity that had drawn him to plan this unconventional tour in the first place. The day was unfolding exactly as he had hoped, not as a performance of royal duty, but as a genuine exploration of ideas and connections that mattered to both of them. Harry led his grandmother toward a section of the show that most visitors overlooked entirely. Tucked between two major display gardens was a modest exhibit called Hidden Worlds, created by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a botanist who specialized in the relationship between plants and wildlife. The space appeared almost wild compared to the manicured perfection of the surrounding exhibits, with native plants arranged to mimic natural ecosystems. "This might not look like much at first glance," Harry said as they approached what seemed like an overgrown meadow, "but I think it's one of the most important gardens here." Dr. Rodriguez was crouched beside a patch of apparently unremarkable wildflowers, a magnifying glass in her hand, and soil staining her knees. When she looked up and saw her visitors, she scrambled to her feet with the awkward enthusiasm of someone more comfortable with plants than royal protocol. "Please, don't let us interrupt your work," the Queen said kindly, genuinely curious about what the scientist had been studying so intently. "I was watching the most extraordinary interaction," Elena explained, her excitement overcoming her nervousness. "There's a solitary bee species that has co-evolved specifically with this native campanula. The timing of their life cycles is synchronized so precisely that the bee emerges just as the flowers open." Harry had discovered Elena's work through his growing interest in conservation. She represented a new generation of scientists who understood that protecting wildlife meant protecting entire ecosystems, not just individual species. Her garden demonstrated how native plants supported networks of insects, birds, and small mammals that most people never noticed. The Queen's attention was immediately captured. As someone who had spent decades observing wildlife on the royal estates, she understood the intricate relationships Elena described. "Show us," she said simply. Elena guided them through what initially appeared to be chaos, but revealed itself as careful design. Each plant had been chosen not just for its beauty, but for its role in supporting native wildlife. Meadow flowers provided nectar for different species of bees and butterflies. Seed-bearing grasses attracted finches and other small birds. Native shrubs offered nesting sites and winter shelter. "Most people think of gardens as human spaces where we impose our vision on nature," Elena explained. "But this approach invites wildlife to participate in the design. The garden changes throughout the seasons based on what the animals and insects need." Harry watched his grandmother's face as Elena pointed out details that would have been invisible to casual observers. A patch of nettles in one corner looked like weeds, but served as the only host plant for several butterfly species. Hollow stems left standing through winter provided nesting sites for beneficial insects. Even the bare soil patches were intentional, creating spaces for ground nesting bees. At Balmoral, the Queen said thoughtfully, "I've noticed that the areas we leave unmown often have the most birds. I hadn't understood why until now." Elena's face lit up. "Exactly. Conventional gardening often works against nature's cycles. We cut everything down in autumn when insects need shelter. We plant non-native flowers that look beautiful but provide no food for local wildlife. We create monocultures that support only a few species." Harry felt a deep satisfaction watching this conversation unfold. This was exactly what he had hoped would happen. His grandmother's extensive practical knowledge connecting with new scientific understanding to create insights neither would have reached alone. Elena showed them a section where she had planted what looked like a traditional English cottage garden border, but every plant was a native species chosen to support wildlife. Beauty and ecological function don't have to be separate goals, she explained. We can have gardens that feed our souls and support the web of life around us. The Queen asked detailed questions about which plants perform best in different soil conditions and how seasonal timing affected wildlife interactions. Her questions revealed both her deep gardening experience and her genuine concern for the wildlife she had observed on royal properties throughout her life. As they moved through the exhibit, Elena pointed out evidence of the wildlife her garden supported. Bee houses showed signs of recent occupation. Bird feeders integrated into the planting revealed which species had been visiting. Even the way plants showed signs of insect browsing told stories about the invisible life the garden sustained. This changes how I think about Sandringham, the Queen said to Harry as they paused beside a small pond designed to support amphibians and provide water for birds. We have hundreds of acres that could support more wildlife if we approach them differently. Harry felt a surge of excitement. His grandmother was seeing connections between Elena's work and her own responsibilities as a landowner. This was exactly the kind of thinking he had hoped their tour might inspire. Practical applications that could make real differences. Elena overheard and ventured to offer suggestions. Native meadows require much less maintenance than formal lawns once they're established, and they support exponentially more wildlife. A single acre of native meadow can support over 100 species of insects, which feed dozens of bird species, which support the entire ecosystem. The conversation that followed revealed the Queen's sophisticated understanding of land management challenges. She discussed drainage issues at different properties, soil conditions that favored certain plants, and the practical considerations of maintaining large estates while supporting wildlife conservation. Harry listened, fascinated by this glimpse into aspects of royal life that were rarely discussed publicly. His grandmother wasn't just a ceremonial figurehead. She was a landowner who made practical decisions that affected thousands of acres and the wildlife they supported. Their next destination was another contrast, a garden designed specifically for children called Young Explorers. The designer, Tom Williams, had created a space that encouraged discovery and hands-on learning. Rather than the careful preservation expected in most gardens, this space invited touching, climbing, and investigation. Tom was surrounded by a group of young visitors from a local primary school when Harry and the Queen arrived. The children were engaged in various activities. Some were building with sticks and stones, others were examining insects through magnifying glasses, and several were creating art with natural materials. The idea is to help children develop a personal relationship with nature. Tom explained after the school group had moved on to another exhibit. Too often, we teach them to look but not touch, to admire but not engage. This garden is designed to be experienced with all the senses. The space included raised beds where children could plant seeds and tend their own small plots. A water feature invited investigation of aquatic life. Climbing structures were integrated with living plants, creating opportunities for both physical activity and botanical education. Harry had been particularly drawn to this exhibit because of his own struggles with conventional education as a child. He remembered feeling most alive during outdoor activities, times when learning happened through experience rather than sitting in classrooms. The garden represented an approach to education that honored different learning styles and recognized the value of direct experience. The Queen watched children from another visiting group engage with the garden's various elements. Some are naturally drawn to the quiet observation of insects and plants. Others gravitated toward the more active elements, climbing, digging, and building. The space accommodated both temperaments while encouraging all children to develop connections with the natural world. My own grandchildren have quite different personalities, the Queen observed to Tom. William has always been drawn to wildlife observation, while Harry was more interested in active exploration. Both approaches can lead to deep appreciation for nature. Harry felt a moment of recognition hearing his grandmother describe his childhood personality. She had been observing and understanding him even during periods when he felt lost or misunderstood. The insight touched him more than he expected. Tom showed them areas where children could leave their marks, a wall where they could create temporary art with natural materials, beds where they could plant seeds to return and tend on future visits, and journals where they could record discoveries and observations. The goal isn't to teach specific facts, Tom explained, but to foster curiosity and connection. Children who feel personally connected to nature become adults who care about protecting it. As they walked through the children's garden, Harry noticed his grandmother stopping to examine details that might seem insignificant to others. The way water moved through a small stream, the arrangement of stones that created hiding places for insects, the careful balance between structured learning opportunities and free exploration. This reminds me of the gardens at Royal Lodge when Margaret and our children, the Queen said. Our governess encouraged us to keep nature diaries, recording what we observe each day. I still have some of those journals. Harry tried to imagine his grandmother as a child, carefully recording observations about birds and flowers. The image connected to his own memories of feeling most at peace during outdoor activities, during times when formal expectations gave way to genuine curiosity about the world around him. As the afternoon progressed, Harry felt increasingly confident that his unconventional approach to the garden tour was revealing new dimensions of his relationship with his grandmother. They were connecting not through formal roles and duties, but through shared curiosity and appreciation for the connections between humans and the natural world. The gardens they had visited so far had demonstrated different aspects of how green spaces could serve human needs while supporting broader environmental goals. Harry had one more exhibit in mind, one that would bring together themes of healing, community, and environmental stewardship in ways he hoped would resonate deeply with both his grandmother's experience and his own evolving understanding of his purpose and responsibilities. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, Harry guided the Queen toward what he considered the most important stop of their tour. The Resilience Garden occupied a prominent location within the show, but its message was more subtle than its positioning might suggest. Created by James Morrison, a landscape architect who was also a veteran of the Falklands War, the garden told a story of recovery and transformation through its very structure and plant choices. Harry had discovered James's work through veterans organizations he had been quietly supporting since returning from Afghanistan. James's approach to garden design was informed by his own journey through post-traumatic stress, and his gardens had become places of healing for other veterans struggling with invisible wounds from military service. "This is the garden I most wanted to share with you," Harry told his grandmother as they approached. "Not because it's the most beautiful, though. It is striking, but because it represents something I've been trying to understand about healing and service." The garden's design immediately communicated its themes. A path wound through areas representing different stages of recovery, from a dark, enclosed space planted with thorny shrubs and hardy plants that could survive in difficult conditions, through transitional areas where more diverse plants began to flourish, to an open, light-filled space where vegetables, flowers, and fruit trees demonstrated abundance and renewal. James emerged from behind a screen of bamboo that created privacy around a small seating area. He was a man in his 50s with calloused hands and steady eyes that suggested someone who had found peace after struggle. When he saw his visitors, he straightened with unconscious military bearing before relaxing into a more natural stance. "Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness," he said with simple dignity. "Welcome to a garden that's taught me more than I ever taught it." Harry had briefed James about the Queen's genuine interest in meaningful conversations, encouraging him to share the real story behind his design rather than offering polite pleasantries. James took the invitation seriously. "This garden represents my own journey back from a very dark place," he began, leading them along the winding path. "After the Falklands, I struggled for years with what I now know was PTSD. I couldn't hold jobs, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't see purpose in civilian life." The Queen listened with the focused attention she brought to subjects that mattered. Harry watched her face as James continued his story, seeing not the polite interest of royal duty, but genuine engagement with human experience that transcended rank and protocol. "I started gardening by accident," James continued, stopping beside plants that looked almost aggressive in their ability to thrive in poor conditions. A mate dragged me to a community garden when I was at my lowest point. Said I needed to get my hands dirty, doing something constructive instead of destructive. The symbolism in the garden's progression became more apparent as James explained his choices. The initial plantings included species that could survive neglect and harsh conditions, reflecting the resilience required during the darkest periods of recovery. Native grasses bent, but didn't break in strong winds. Evergreen shrubs maintained their structure through seasons of dormancy and renewal. These plants taught me that survival isn't about avoiding all damage, James explained. It's about developing root systems strong enough to withstand storms and regenerate when conditions improve. Harry felt the power of this metaphor in his own life. His military service had exposed him to experiences that had fundamentally changed him, and he was still learning how to integrate those changes into his civilian identity. The garden's progression from survival to flourishing offered a framework for understanding healing as a process rather than a destination. As they moved deeper into the garden, the plantings became more diverse and abundant. James had introduced vegetables and herbs that required regular care and attention, representing the stage of recovery where veterans could begin to nurture something outside themselves. The act of tending plants provided structure, purpose, and the satisfaction of seeing growth result from consistent effort. Gardening demands patience, James observed. You can't rush a plant's growth, and you can't undo mistakes immediately. But you can learn from what doesn't work and adjust your approach. It's a forgiving teacher for people who've been very hard on themselves. The Queen asked practical questions about soil preparation and plant selection, but Harry could tell she was also absorbing the deeper lessons James shared. Her own life had required different kinds of resilience. The ability to endure decades of public scrutiny, to maintain stability during periods of national and personal crisis, to find meaning in duty when personal preference might suggest other choices. The garden's final section opened into a generous space where fruit trees provided shade for seeding areas, and raised beds demonstrated productive abundance. Here, James grew food that he shared with other veterans and local community members. The garden had evolved from a place of personal healing to a space that supported broader community well-being. This is where the metaphor becomes real action, James explained. Recovery isn't just about getting back to where you were before. It's about becoming someone who can contribute to healing in the world around you. Harry felt this truth resonate deeply. His own journey through grief, military service, and the challenges of finding his role within the royal family had led him toward understanding service not as duty imposed from outside, but as purpose discovered through personal growth and connection to causes larger than himself. The Queen spent considerable time in this final section, asking about harvest yields, preservation techniques, and how James organized the sharing of produce with community members. Her questions revealed appreciation for the practical aspects of James's work, but also understanding of its broader significance. During the war, Victory Gardens served multiple purposes, she reflected. They provided food security, but they also gave civilians a way to contribute meaningfully to the war effort. This reminds me of that individual healing that serves community needs. James nodded emphatically. That's exactly right, Your Majesty. When veterans feel useful again, when they're contributing to something positive, the healing accelerates. It's not enough to just manage symptoms. People need purpose. As they prepare to leave the Resilience Garden, James showed them a section where other veterans had contributed their own plantings and design elements. Each edition told a different story of recovery, creating a collective narrative of transformation that was more powerful than any individual story. Harry felt overwhelmed by the connections he was seeing between his grandmother's lifelong experience of service and his own evolving understanding of how personal growth could serve broader purposes. The garden demonstrated that healing wasn't selfish or self-indulgent. It was essential preparation for meaningful contribution to the world. Their final stop was a garden that brought together many of the themes they had explored throughout the afternoon. The Future Forest was designed by a team of young environmental scientists who had created a demonstration of how urban forests could address multiple challenges simultaneously: air pollution, climate change, mental health, and community cohesion. The garden showcased trees and shrubs that could thrive in urban conditions while providing maximum environmental benefits. Interactive displays showed how different species filtered air pollutants, absorbed carbon dioxide, and created cooling microclimates. But the design also included spaces for human interaction and community gathering. Dr. Sarah Kim, the lead designer, was just finishing a presentation to a group of city planners when Harry and the Queen arrived. She was a young woman with infectious enthusiasm for the potential of urban forests to transform cities both environmentally and socially. Trees are infrastructure, she explained as they walked among saplings that represented different stages of forest development. They provide services that traditional infrastructure can't match: air purification, temperature regulation, stormwater management, and psychological restoration. The Queen examined labels that identified each species and described its particular contributions to urban ecosystems. Her questions revealed familiarity with forestry management from the royal estates, but also curiosity about how scientific understanding had evolved since the forests she knew had been planted decades earlier. Harry was struck by the optimism inherent in forest gardening. Planting trees required faith in the future, commitment to benefits that might not be fully realized for decades. The act embodied exactly the kind of long-term thinking that his grandmother had demonstrated throughout her reign, decisions made not for immediate gratification, but for generational benefit. Young people today understand that the choices we make now will determine the world they inherit, Sarah explained. Urban forests represent hope, proof that we can heal damaged environments and create spaces where humans and nature thrive together. As the afternoon drew toward its close, Harry felt a profound sense of completion. The gardens they had visited had demonstrated different aspects of how green spaces could serve human needs while supporting broader environmental and community goals. More importantly, they had created opportunities for genuine connection between himself and his grandmother that transcended their formal roles and revealed shared values and concerns. The Queen's engagement throughout the tour had been authentic and sustained. She had asked thoughtful questions, shared relevant experiences from her own life, and demonstrated appreciation for the innovative approaches they had encountered. Harry felt that his intuition about wanting to share something meaningful with her had been validated by her response. As they began walking back toward the main entrance where the Queen's car would be waiting, Harry reflected on what the afternoon had revealed about both of them. His grandmother's wisdom and experience had provided context and depth to the discoveries he was making about purpose and service. Her willingness to engage with new ideas had encouraged him to continue exploring how his own interests and concerns might develop into meaningful contribution. As they walked slowly back through the main avenue of the Chelsea Flower Show, the late afternoon sun cast golden light through the canopies of the prize-winning displays they had largely bypassed in favor of smaller, more meaningful gardens. The irony wasn't lost on Harry. They'd spent their time with the quiet innovators and thoughtful designers rather than the grand spectacles that would capture newspaper headlines and television coverage. The Queen paused beside a magnificent traditional rose garden that exemplified the kind of formal perfection for which Chelsea was famous. The roses were flawless, the arrangement symmetrical, and the overall effect undeniably beautiful. Yet after the afternoon they had shared, both she and Harry found themselves admiring it with a different perspective. "Beautiful," the Queen observed, "but I find myself wondering what wildlife it supports, whether the roses are heritage varieties, how the design might serve people beyond visual pleasure." Harry smiled at this evidence that their tour had indeed influenced how his grandmother was seeing gardens. "A few months ago, I would have walked past most of the gardens we visited today without really seeing them," he admitted. "They would have seemed too small or unconventional to capture my attention." They continued walking in comfortable silence, both processing the conversations and discoveries of the afternoon. Near the entrance, they encountered one final exhibit that neither had planned to visit, but that seemed to call for their attention. The Memory Garden was created by elderly residents of a local care facility working with a professional designer to create a space that honored both personal memories and collective history. The designer, Patricia Wells, noticed their approach and welcomed them warmly. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and hands that showed evidence of decades spent working with soil and plants. Her elderly collaborators had gone home for the day, but their contributions were evident throughout the small garden. This space represents 5 years of weekly sessions with residents who wanted to create something lasting, Patricia explained. Each plant, each pathway, each decorative element reflects their memories and experiences. The garden combined formal elements that evoked earlier eras with more contemporary approaches to accessible design. Raised beds brought plants within reach of visitors using wheelchairs or walkers. Seating areas were positioned to encourage both quiet contemplation and social interaction. Plant choices reflected both horticultural wisdom passed down through generations and newer understanding of therapeutic benefits. Mrs. Henderson chose those lavender varieties because they matched the ones her mother grew during the 1920s, Patricia said, pointing to a carefully tended border. Mr. Davies insisted on a vegetable section because he remembers growing food during rationing and wants young people to understand how much can be produced in small spaces. Harry was moved by the way this garden embodied connections between past and present. The elderly residents had shared not just their knowledge, but their lived experience of historical events that had shaped the nation. Their gardens served as both personal memorial and educational resource for younger generations. The Queen examined the garden with particular attention to details that reflected historical periods she had personally experienced. A section dedicated to Victory Garden vegetables included varieties that had sustained the nation during World War II. Heritage roses represented cultivars that had been popular during different decades of a reign. Even the garden tools displayed in a small shed reflected the evolution of gardening practices over the past century. This reminds me that gardens are repositories of memory, the Queen reflected. Every choice represents someone's knowledge, experience, and values. Gardens connect us to the people who came before us and influence the people who will come after. As they prepared to leave the memory garden, Patricia mentioned that the care facility residents were planning to expand their project by working with local schools. The children will learn traditional gardening techniques from the elders, while the residents will discover new approaches to sustainability and wildlife conservation from the young people. It's designed to be a true exchange of knowledge across generations. Harry felt a moment of recognition at this description. The afternoon he had shared with his grandmother had been exactly that kind of exchange, his enthusiasm for innovation and environmental consciousness meeting her decades of practical experience and institutional wisdom. Both had learned from the other, and both had been enriched by the conversation. As they finally reached the entrance where the Queen's car waited, Harry felt reluctant to end what had been one of the most meaningful interactions he had shared with his grandmother in years. The formal distance that usually characterized their public appearances had given way to genuine collaboration and mutual discovery. "Thank you for this afternoon, Harry," the Queen said, and her words carried warmth that went beyond polite gratitude. "You've shown me that gardens can be much more than I had understood. Not just beautiful spaces, but places where real problems can be addressed and real healing can happen." Harry felt a surge of emotion at this acknowledgement. His grandmother's recognition of what he had tried to share meant more to him than any formal honor or public recognition. "I think I learned as much as you did, Granny," he replied. "Seeing everything through your eyes helped me understand connections I hadn't recognized before." The Queen's driver approached discreetly, indicating that her departure time had arrived. But before moving toward the car, she turned back to Harry with an expression that combined affection with something that looked like professional respect. "I'd like you to think about how these ideas might be implemented on the royal estates," she said. "Balmoral and Sandringham have thousands of acres that could demonstrate the approaches we've seen today. Perhaps you could work with the estate managers to develop proposals for incorporating wildlife corridors, therapeutic gardens, and educational programs." Harry felt his breath catch. This wasn't just praise for his afternoon's tour. This was his grandmother offering him a meaningful role in stewarding royal lands according to principles they had discovered together. The prospect of meaningful work that connected his personal interests with his institutional responsibilities was exactly what he had been seeking without knowing how to ask for it. "I would love that opportunity," he said, trying to keep the eagerness from his voice while making clear his genuine interest. The Queen nodded with satisfaction. "I think your mother would have appreciated what you've shown me today," she said quietly. She understood that real leadership comes from seeing connections that others miss and caring enough to act on that understanding. The reference to Princess Diana brought tears to Harry's eyes. His grandmother rarely spoke directly about his mother, and to hear her connect his interests and insights to Diana's legacy was both painful and healing. It suggested that his search for meaningful purpose was recognized not as rebellion against royal tradition, but as continuation of values his mother had embodied. As the Queen's car pulled away from the Royal Hospital Chelsea, Harry stood alone among the departing visitors and tired exhibitors, feeling transformed by the afternoon in ways he was still processing. The gardens they had visited had demonstrated practical solutions to real problems, but more importantly, they had provided a framework for understanding how personal growth and institutional responsibility could work together rather than in opposition. In the weeks that followed, Harry threw himself into researching sustainable land management practices and therapeutic garden programs with the same intensity he had once applied to military training. He visited the royal estates with new eyes, identifying opportunities to implement the innovations he and his grandmother had discovered together. The estate managers, initially skeptical of changes proposed by a young prince with no formal training in land management, found themselves impressed by Harry's practical questions and genuine commitment to learning. His proposals were grounded in scientific research and informed by conversations with experts who had devoted their careers to understanding how human welfare and environmental health could be mutually supporting. Within months, pilot programs were underway at both Balmoral and Sandringham. Wildlife corridors connected previously isolated habitats. Demonstration gardens showed how traditional farming techniques could be enhanced with contemporary understanding of soil health and biodiversity. Educational programs brought school groups to see working examples of sustainable land use. The Queen followed these developments with keen interest, asking for regular reports and occasionally visiting to see progress firsthand. The collaboration that had begun during their afternoon at Chelsea continued to deepen, creating new connections between Harry's evolving sense of purpose and his grandmother's lifelong commitment to responsible stewardship. More importantly for Harry personally, the experience had shown him that finding his own path didn't require rejecting his family legacy, but rather understanding how his unique perspective and interests could contribute to values that connected past and future. The gardens had taught him that growth and tradition could work together, that innovation could honor history while addressing contemporary challenges. Years later, when visitors to the royal estates remarked on the innovative approaches to land management and conservation they observed, Harry would remember an afternoon spent walking among flowers and vegetables with his grandmother, discovering that the most important lessons about leadership and service have been growing quietly in gardens all along, waiting for the right moment to take root and flourish. The seeds planted during their Chelsea tour had grown into something neither had fully envisioned, but both had hoped for, a way of working that honored the past while embracing the future, that served institutional responsibilities while expressing personal convictions, and that demonstrated how genuine understanding between generations could create possibilities that neither could have achieved alone. In the end, the afternoon at the Chelsea Flower Show had been about much more than gardens. It had been about discovering that the most profound connections often grow quietly, nurtured by attention and care until they bloom into relationships and projects that serve purposes larger than any individual could imagine. Like the best gardens, their collaboration would continue to evolve, surprise, and bear fruit for years to come.